About 53 million Americans care for a spouse, an elderly parent, another relative, or a special needs child. Often, the call to caregiving for many of us is a big surprise when a loved one faces a sudden illness or has an accident. You know what? We don't have time to plan. Frankly, we don't have time to think about it. We just jump in and we do it. Now, it's a skill set that doesn't come naturally to everyone, yet we have to rise to the occasion in the best way we can because we don't have a choice. Now, chances are all of us in our lifetimes are going to face this if we haven't already, especially if you are a woman and you are in midlife and your parents are getting older. So, my first guest today is Stephanie Knichel. Stephanie cared for and lost both of her parents. Her father died of cancer in 2017. And when he became sick, she became her father's primary caregiver, driving him to his appointments, taking care of him. And then during COVID, after her father died, Stephanie didn't see much of her mother because she was elderly and suffering from diabetes. But as soon as they reconnected, she noticed a mental decline. Again, Stephanie became her primary caregiver. Her mother was diagnosed with dementia. After many falls, hospital stays, stints in rehab, she died in July of 2024. Now, although Stephanie says she really lost her in March of 2024 because that's when she stopped knowing her daughter. Stephanie, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
I know this is really hard to talk about, but I think it's really important to talk about. As I mentioned to you, I lost my mother to a brain tumor in 2012. I was also a primary caregiver. Although my journey was not as long as some people's, I think I can relate to it because it is something that you're just kind of thrown into, right? You don't really even know where to start.
Yep.
But you did it twice,
Yep.
which is really staggering. And I think it's also really difficult because there's not a lot of support for caregivers. And we have to go through so much, right? It's physical, it's mental, it's emotional. This really resonated for me when you talked about the concept of you're taking care of your parent, but you're grieving them at the same time, and especially with dementia. Talk a little bit about that. How you balance those emotions?
So the diagnosis of my mom wasn't a surprise. Like the official diagnosis wasn't a surprise. And it is extraordinarily emotional, but you also no one can tell you a time frame at all about, you ask the questions like, is she going to remember me tomorrow? Is it going to be a month? Is she going to be able to swallow? Is she going to be able to get out of bed and walk to the bathroom? But like, you can ask the question to 20 people and everyone says the same thing. We just don't know. So every day when I would walk in to see my mom, it was, what am I going to walk into? So that was almost like scary. Every time there was a change in her condition, a decline, I didn't know how fast it was going to go. Even when she went on hospice, they told me that this could go on for a year, but it only went on for 6 weeks. So I wasn't really prepared for the end because no one can tell you. It was very difficult. I did lean on my friends a little bit, but nobody really knows what to say because I would tell these crazy stories of the things that my mom was doing, and it was so horrifying for them to hear, and really nobody could really help me. I was just, even my husband and my children were not able to
Yeah,
help me.
I was gonna. Since you brought it up, I mean, I want to go back and start with your father's journey, but I think the biggest issue, right, for a lot of us is support. How do we get support from people? Because we don't even know what we need. And like you said, people don't know what to say. I mean, did you have support? You said family, friends,
Yeah.
some support, but it was just hard for them to
No one
figure
could
out
really
what you needed.
relate. Like, even I found some people that had parents with dementia, but dementia is so different for every person and for every age. So I had some friends that have parents in their 70s that have dementia, but they have long to live. And they're at like the earlier stages of dementia. But my mom she was at an advanced dementia, like in March when she stopped knowing who I was. And she was older, so she was 83. So an 83-year-old person with advanced dementia is very different than a 77-year-old person with early dementia. So I didn't really have anyone that was like in my exact spot ever.
Right. Who could talk about it?
Yeah.
So, talk about first because your dad's journey was your first experience with caregiving, and he had esophageal cancer.
Yep. Which was a horrible diagnosis.
But
Terminal upon diagnosis.
your mom was there, but she couldn't really care for him in many ways, and so you had to step up and do that. Was this a big shock and surprise to you? And how did you just jump in and do it?
Well, my mom was a city person, so she didn't get her driver's license till she was in her late 30s. So she wasn't a great driver. And the driving for that type of diagnosis is all over. It's Durham, it's, to chemo, it's back to Durham, it's all over. And I just knew that I was going to
She
be
couldn't do it.
nope,
Yeah.
nope. Also, she and I don't know if maybe she was in the early stages then, but she couldn't accept the terminal diagnosis. So she felt like my dad was going to be okay for a long time. Like she would say, we're going to sit outside and have coffee in the spring when the flowers start blooming. And I was like, God, why is she saying this?
Yeah.
Um, and I couldn't squash her hope because she said to me, if I don't have hope, I have nothing. So I had to kind of just let her live like that. But I knew the whole time that we only had 3 to 6 months. So I just had to take him to radiation every day at the beginning. And then it was chemo once a month. I had to take him. I took him to all of his doctor's appointments everywhere. And it was usually just the two of us. And I treasure that time that I had with him when it was just us. And that's why I said it was easier.
For you to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
And the driving thing reminds me because my mom had radiation at Duke, and it was at the time we lived in Cary, North Carolina. It was 57 miles round trip every
Yep.
single day, so it was
Yep.
a lot of driving.
Yep.
And I do like though that talking about treasuring that time because while it's so difficult, you're really humbled in a way to be able to do that for your parent, right? To
Oh,
give back to them.
and he was so grateful.
Yeah, for what they
Um,
do for you.
yeah, I mean, he was, and it was heartbreaking to try to help him out of the car, when things went, because how radiation's cumulative. And that's so towards the end, he was just so weak. And this is this strong Italian man from the Bronx. This was a tough guy. And his daughter is lifting him out of the passenger seat of the car into a wheelchair. I think,
I felt I had the hardest time lifting my mom back into the car. And I had several times where I had to get help because
mhm.
I couldn't do it.
Yep. And they try, right? They're holding on to
Yeah.
everything, trying so
Yeah.
hard.
Because they want to help you.
Yep. Because you're still their child,
Right.
even though the roles.
It's a role reversal.
Yes. Yes.
So pandemic happens, your father's passed away,
Hmm.
and your mom is not doing well, but you can't see her because she's got some health conditions and she's vulnerable.
Yep.
Um, when did you first notice that something's going on that you thought might be dementia?
So it started with her telling me a story in the morning and then telling me the same story in the evening because I was calling her all the time. I could not call her multiple times a day to make sure she was okay. Because she was, I mean, we would bring the groceries and literally leave them at the door. We would be wiping down the bags and stuff at her front door and then running to the car so she wouldn't try to catch us before we left because she was not as cautious.
Right. And she
She
was
wanted to
very
see us.
isolated.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, it was terrible. She's not phone savvy, so we couldn't FaceTime or see each other's faces even because she just was not she could barely make a call on the phone. She just couldn't do it. Um, so talking to her through that, but then my husband was like, well, she just lost her husband very recently of 52 years and she's alone all the time, so she's probably getting a little bit off. And I kind of like allowed people to convince me of that. But I regret that because I knew that my mom was declining. She's a certified by her IQ genius. She was incredibly well read, just a brilliant woman, funny and and like so quick. And I knew that something was wrong, but a lot of people blamed a lot of things on the isolation of COVID too, including like, our kids and stuff like that. So you kind of just like roll with it, like what everybody's saying, and like, okay, well, maybe she's just isolated. And when this is all over and we start to see each other again, I can like bring her back and be seeing her and taking her to lunch and stuff like that. But soon after, when everything kind of got released and we started seeing her again, I would take her somewhere like my cousin's house, who lives close by in New Hope, and she would forget like a month later that we had gone there at all. She would say, "I'd never been to her house. I don't know what you're talking about. Like, I've never been there." And she convinced me almost. She was so adamant that she convinced me that maybe I was like, "Was she there? I remember her being there, but was she?" And I called my cousin and I'd be like, "She was with me that day, right? When you hosted Easter?" And yeah, she was there. So it just was like, what's going on? So I took her to the doctor and her primary care doctor, and they like do all the. I don't know if you're familiar with like the tests that they do where they have them
Mm-hmm.
draw a clock and stuff like that. She always passed those tests, but then she had a bad fall in her home, and it was a really bad fall, and I had to take her to the emergency room, and I felt like she was really like I thought they said she wasn't concussed, but she was at this point definitely acting like she was in a serious state of mental decline. I took her to her primary care doctor, and they said that she was not taking her diabetes medication, and that was causing the confusion. And they said they could give me a diagnosis of dementia, but it's irrelevant in the medical community because there's no treatment for it. So the responsibility lies upon the decision makers in the family of how we proceed with her mental decline.
You mentioned in your notes to me
Mhm.
that losing your mom in this way, watching her with this mental decline, was just the hardest thing you've experienced in your life.
Mhm. Absolutely. So when my father died, and when my father was sick and he died, I was able to talk to him every day about meaningful things or not meaningful things, like Penn State scores or Yankees or whatever it was. We could talk about sports. We could talk about food, even though he couldn't eat. He wanted me to have all of his recipes, and so we could talk about stuff. And I was able to spend a really great quality time with him in his last months of life. But with my mom, her second fall, she became immobile and incontinent, which caused her dementia to spiral. And so, for the first 3 months of after she fell in this past January, we had weird conversations. Like she thought I was in high school, but she could still talk to me. So she would ask me about my love life, even though I've been married for 20 years. Um, she thought she lived in her home in Philadelphia, and she would always say the address, and she would describe the home. She thought like she lived in North Carolina for 20 years also, but had no recollection of living in this state. So I would say to her, like the nurses or the doctors, like, she thinks we're in Philadelphia, but like she doesn't remember that we lived in North Carolina. And they said that's just how her disease is progressing. And eventually, the way her disease progressed is she completely forgot my children first, then my husband, and then me. Um, so when I would walk in the room, she thought it was like another person who maybe worked in the facility she was in. Um, and
And
that,
that's heartbreaking, right?
oh, And so then it introduces a new challenge, right? Because now I have a person who he can't communicate with me anything about how she feels. So I didn't know if she was lonely, or if she was tired, or if she was hungry, or if she was in pain, or if she was thirsty. So I would go every single day to make sure that I could try to figure out what her needs were and then attend to them.
This was not that long ago. This,
Mm-mm.
sh- how are you doing?
So the day that my mom died, it was so when my father died, he was asleep. Like, they hospice does amazing things with medication to try to prevent pain. Um, we did not have that experience with my mom. So my mom was awake when she died, and she was looking at me. Um, like she took her last breath and her eyes were open looking at me. Um, and my husband came and my brother came, and I said, I don't have any parents. And so my parents, and I know everyone has a different experience with their moms and dads. Like, I talk about it with my friends all the time. But my parents were like, great. Like, biggest cheerleaders, like, supported me, like, academically my whole life to make sure I had all the resources I need to be successful. Like, they're always like so proud of me. Everything that I did was like the biggest deal to them. And that's really like feeds your ego, right? To have someone that's like got your back no matter what. Someone you could like talk about, like I could call my mom if I had like an argument with my husband and be like, oh my God, and she'd be like, you're just being silly. Don't, she always said, like, don't fight over little things because you're going to end up fighting over big things. And that's what matters. You don't fight over the little things. Don't cause, it's just good advice. And like all of a sudden I was like, I don't have anyone now. There's no one that knows me and everything that I've done in my life more than my mom and dad. And so the loss then, even though I said I lost my mom in March when she did not know who I was anymore, the loss then was like a whole different kind of thing. Like I was alone.
Exponential.
Yeah, I was
Yeah.
alone. Like, not that my husband isn't amazing, because he is. My children are in their like late teens, very like sympathetic and amazing also. But your parents, like, I don't know.
They're your anchors to the world, is how I would describe it from my experience. And
Yeah.
your experience, the way you lost your mom with her eyes being open, taking her last breath, that's exactly what happened to me.
Oh my God.
And so you know, I was equally scared of not being there
Yeah.
and of being there.
Yeah.
And so in the end, I was able to process it by saying I was there, and
Yeah.
that was good. And that with some reflection. So, Stephanie, having gone through what you've gone through, two things.
Mm-hmm.
Should there be more support for caregivers? And what advice would you give people who may be on this journey or about to enter this journey?
So there should definitely be more support for the caregivers. And I don't know how to accomplish that. And I thought about that since I knew I was going to talk to you today. Because when my mom went on hospice, like I said, it was only like a few weeks before she died. Then all of a sudden, the social workers coming and people are saying, how can we help you? We're going to go see her today to give you a break. We're going to have someone come in and play the piano for her because she was a brilliant piano player. So we're going to have someone play classical music for her today. So they did things to help me. But it was like all of that time before where I was just doing it on my own, where I really could have, I don't know, had someone sit with her so I
Yeah.
could go food shopping.
Well, and I think maybe part of this advice is figure out what you need and try to find people who can help you with that. And even if it's a friend who just keeps saying, what can I do to help you? Hey, would you mind sitting with my mom for an hour today? Like not being afraid to tell people what you need.
Yeah, I guess everyone did offer, but my mom was in such poor condition. I felt like it was a big ask. Like, we had friends that would come over and hang out with my dad when he was sick, but my mom was she had like delirium, and she had pica. Do you know what that is?
I don't.
That's when you eat everything. She would pull out her IV and eat it. She
Okay.
would eat her clothes, her sheets.
So you felt like this just wasn't something you could ask people to do. Yeah.
So I would do it for someone else now, like, because I know what it's like. But I feel like someone who didn't like ease themselves into it like I did, like, over time, my mom declined. I was there for every stage of it, so knew what to expect. But how could I ask a friend to go sit with my mom, who's incontinent and in a diaper, who can't really speak but is eating her clothes?
Right. So obviously there were a lot of layers to it in terms of how you get help.
And there's
But it's
money, and there's like the money involved in the facilities where they can barely keep anyone on staff. I remember one girl told me that she would make more money if she worked at Chick-fil-A. And this is the person who's like changing my mom's sheets every time she had an accident, changing her clothes and stuff like that. So I
right.
feel
So
like,
so maybe higher pay for the
yeah,
people who
well,
do this
yeah,
work. So
yeah.
not just caring for the caregivers in the family, but caring for the caregivers in the facilities, making sure they have what they need. Because if they don't, it's very hard,
I feel
like
like
you said,
that's
to
the
maintain the
biggest
workforce.
thing. Even when my mom was at Duke at the beginning, there were people calling out all the time. There were nurses that were doing like 3 nights, like just I'm like day and night. I mean, like
Yeah.
three.
So it was a lot of burden on them. Well, Stephanie, thank you for sharing your
Sure.
story with us. And I think a lot of women can relate to this
Yep.
and will definitely benefit from knowing they're not alone, that other people have gone through it.
Yep. Thank you.
Thanks. We'll be back in a moment.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.